When I lost everything, my parents looked me in the eye and said, "We can't help you." I had nowhere to go. Then my aunt opened her door and gave me a place to sleep in her basement. For years, she was the only person who believed in me. 10 years later, my parents sat across the room and watched as I walked over to my aunt, handed her something she never expected, and thanked her for saving my life. I was 26 years old the Tuesday they laid me off, and the thing I remember most clearly about that day is not the conversation with my manager, not the cardboard box, not the walk to my car in the parking garage. It's the math. I did it in my head before I even made it to the elevator. It was automatic, the way your brain sometimes solves a problem before you've consciously decided to solve it. Rent was $140 a month, and I was already 2 months behind. My checking account had $47 in it. Not $47 and some change. $47. I checked that morning when I bought a coffee before work, because I always checked when I bought something. The way you check before stepping off a curb even when you're pretty sure nothing's coming. One credit card with $200 left on it. A second card that was already maxed. A car payment due in 11 days. Student loans in deferment but not for much longer. I remember sitting in my car in the parking garage on the 4th floor. I always parked on the 4th floor because it was easier to remember than whatever floor I actually ended up on. And I just did the math over and over. Not because the numbers were going to change, just because my brain couldn't stop. The job had been at a mid-sized marketing firm. Nothing special. I'd been there 2 years, long enough to stop feeling like a new hire, not long enough to feel like I had any real ground under me. When my manager called me in that morning, I thought it was about the Henderson account, which had been messy for 6 weeks and was technically more his fault than mine, but I was braced to absorb some of it anyway. Instead, there was an HR person I'd never seen before sitting in the chair against the wall, and I understood immediately. Restructuring. My role had been eliminated. They appreciated everything I'd contributed. The cardboard box was already under the desk. I sat in that parking garage for probably 20 minutes. Then I drove home. The apartment felt different in the middle of a Tuesday. Too quiet. Too much light coming in through the windows at the wrong angle. I sat on my couch with my coat still on and stared at the wall, and then I picked up my phone and called my parents. Not because I thought they would fix it. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't calling expecting them to solve anything. I just needed to say it out loud to someone who knew my name, and they were the first people I thought of. And that's what you do when something bad happens. You call the people you're supposed to call. My dad picked up on the second ring. I'd rehearsed it slightly on the drive over. Not consciously, but the way you sort of shape a sentence before you say it out loud. I told my dad what happened. Laid off that morning, company restructuring, no warning. I was 2 months behind on rent. I had almost nothing in my account. I needed, and here's where I kept the language careful because I didn't want to sound like I was demanding anything. I needed help figuring out next steps. Maybe a place to stay for a little while. A few weeks. Just enough time to get back on my feet. There was a pause. Not a long one, just long enough that I knew what was coming. My dad said they couldn't take on any extra stress right now. My grandmother, his mother, who lived 40 minutes north of them, had a health scare the month before. Her blood pressure had been erratic and the doctors were still adjusting her medications, and the whole thing had shaken him pretty badly. I knew that. I'd called him when it happened. Things were still unsettled. It wasn't a good time. I said I understood. Then he said he was going to hand me to my mom, and he did. My mom's version was different in tone, but not in outcome. She listened to me explain the situation again, and when I was done, she said something I have turned over in my mind many times in the years since. She said maybe this would teach me to save better. Not unkindly. That's the part that's hard to explain to people when I tell this story. She didn't say it the way you'd say something cruel. She said it the way you'd tell a kid that a scraped knee is a good reminder to slow down on a bike. Gently. With something that was almost, in her mind, helpfulness. Like the layoff and the empty bank account and the 2 months of back rent were a curriculum, and the lesson was about to really stick. And she was glad in a way because now maybe I'd finally learn it. I said okay. I said I'd figure something out. I hung up. I had driven to their house without planning to. I realized that as I sat there in their driveway. I'd gotten in the car at my apartment thinking I was going home to call them, but somewhere on the highway I'd just driven there instead, on autopilot, because that's where your body takes you when things fall apart, apparently. Toward the house where you grew up, toward the people who were supposed to be the last resort. I sat in their driveway and stared at the garage door for 10 minutes. I could see my mom moving behind the kitchen window. She didn't come out. Then I drove away. I didn't have a plan. That's the honest answer for what I did next. I drove for a while. I got on the highway going north without a destination, and drove until the act of driving started to feel like too much. And then I took an exit I didn't recognize and sat in a gas station parking lot and tried to think. The thing about a real financial crisis, not a tight month, not a rough stretch, but an actual crisis where the math doesn't work no matter how many times you do it, is that your brain goes very quiet. It's not panicking exactly. It's more like the way a computer slows down when it's running too many things at once. Everything processes slower. You look at your options and none of them quite compute. I could call my friend Marcus. We'd been close in college, but he'd moved across the country 2 years ago for a job, and we talked maybe 4 times a year now. I could call my friend Jade, but she had a 1-bedroom apartment and a roommate, and I already knew before I finished the thought that I wasn't going to ask her. I could look at the math on the credit card and figure out how many nights of a motel that would buy me. I could call my landlord and explain and see if she'd work with me. I could. My phone rang. My aunt. Her name on the screen. We talked maybe once a month, sometimes less, not because of any distance between us, but just because of the low-grade busyness of adult life. life. I almost didn't answer because I didn't know what she wanted and I didn't have the bandwidth for anything other than what was already happening. I answered. She said my name. She said she'd heard through my cousin, who'd heard from my mom, who had apparently been comfortable enough to share what had happened with other relatives, even if she wasn't comfortable enough to share a spare bedroom. My aunt didn't ask questions, didn't offer opinions, didn't make me explain anything. She just said, come over. That's it. 2 words. Like it was obvious. Like there had never been any other option, and she was a little surprised I hadn't thought of it myself. I said, okay. I said I'd be there in about 40 minutes. She said, okay. Then she hung up. I sat in the gas station parking lot for another minute. Then I drove back to my apartment, packed a duffel bag with enough for a week, put it in my car, and drove to my aunt's house. She lives on a street that looks like every other street in that part of town. Small lots, older houses, one of those neighborhoods that was probably farmland 70 years ago, and then got developed in the 50s and has been slowly cycling through generations of families ever since. Her house is a 3-bedroom Cape Cod, white with dark green shutters, a big oak tree in the front yard that drops an impractical amount of acorns every fall. She'd bought it on her own 11 years earlier. She'd been through a divorce. No kids, just the accumulated wreckage of a marriage that had stopped working long before anyone admitted it, and she'd come out the other side with the equity from the house they'd sold and the determination to own something that was purely hers. She worked in medical billing. She was good at it in the way that competent, unglamorous people are good at unglamorous jobs, reliably without drama, in a way that made the people around her able to do their own jobs better. She opened the front door before I knocked. I don't know if she'd been watching for my car or if she just happened to be nearby, but she was already there when I came up the porch steps. She looked at me the way people look at you when they can tell something is really wrong, and they're not going to make a production of that. Just steady, just present. She said, come in, and I did. She showed me the basement. You got to it through a door off the kitchen, which meant every time I went to sleep I had to walk past her refrigerator with its photos held on by magnets and its little chalkboard where she kept a grocery list. The stairs were steep. The ceiling in the basement was lower than normal, low enough that if I stood at my full height in the middle of the room and raised my arms, I'd touch it. Pull-out couch, one bare bulb on a cord hanging from the ceiling, a metal shelving unit full of neatly labeled boxes, Christmas, Halloween, tax returns, 2014, 2018, and so on. A utility sink in the corner, the water heater, which made a sound like a deep breath every time it kicked on, and the space heater, a small orange one on the floor near the couch. She clicked it on to show me it worked, and it immediately filled the room with that smell. Hot dust, something slightly electrical, the particular smell of something that's been sitting unused for months. She said sorry about that. She'd been meaning to replace it for a couple of years and just kept forgetting. She looked genuinely apologetic, which struck me because I was standing in her basement about to sleep on her pull-out couch because my parents had sent me away, and she was apologizing for a space heater. I said it was perfect. She laughed. Not a big laugh, just a laugh. Like she appreciated that I was being gracious about it. Then she said she had to go finish something and she'd be upstairs if I needed anything, and she went back up. I made up the couch with the blanket she'd left folded on the cushion. It was a quilt, the kind with interlocking squares in different shades of blue. I remember lying on it that first night, staring up at the bare bulb. It had a pull cord, which I hadn't seen in a house since I was a kid, and thinking about how my life had arrived at this exact configuration. The space heater's smell had mostly faded. The water heater took its periodic deep breaths. Outside, I could hear wind in the oak tree. I fell asleep faster than I expected to. Here is what my aunt did not do. She did not sit me down for a talk about responsibility. She did not ask me to explain, in detail, what decisions had led me here, the way my mother would have done it, cataloging the choices like evidence. She did not make me feel in any specific or identifiable way that I was a burden or a project or something she was tolerating. She did not bring up the situation unless I brought it up first. She did not treat any of it as something that required processing out loud between us. Here is what she did instead. Every morning before her 6 a.m. shift, she left coffee on the counter, already made. She used a programmable machine, and she just set it up the night before so there would be coffee waiting when I came upstairs. Sometimes there was also a piece of toast on a plate with butter, sometimes not. I think it depended on how much time she had before she needed to leave. She was always already gone when I came up. Never saw her do it. Just came upstairs every morning to the kitchen and there was coffee. No note, not a text, not a mention of it later, just coffee. I know this sounds like a small thing. I know it sounds like basic hospitality, the kind of thing you do for a house guest without giving it much thought, but I want to try to explain what it felt like to receive it when everything else was the way it was. There's a particular kind of shame that comes with needing help at an age when you're supposed to not need it anymore. You feel it in your body more than your mind. It's in how you hold yourself when you walk into a room, how you answer when someone asks how things are going, how you size up every interaction for the risk that the other person is about to notice you, see through you, calculate the ways you've come up short. It sits on your chest. The coffee did something to that. Not because coffee is magic, but because it was quiet. Because it didn't require anything from me. No gratitude performed at the right volume. No conversation that circled back to the circumstances that had brought me there. It was just there. It said, in the plainest possible terms, you are a person who deserves to have things waiting for them. Not earned, not contingent, just waiting. And that when I felt the worst about myself, which was most of those mornings in the first few weeks, that was what the coffee meant. She'd ask if I was hungry when I came up in the evenings. Sometimes we'd watch TV. She liked competitive baking shows and true crime documentaries, a combination I found quietly funny, and we'd watch whichever she was in the mood for. We talked, but not about anything heavy. She'd tell me things that happened at work, something a coworker said, a billing code that had been causing problems for 3 weeks and had finally been resolved. I'd tell her whatever I'd done that day. Mostly it was just the ordinary background noise of two people existing in the same house. It wasn't that she was incurious about my situation. I think she just understood instinctively that making me talk about it wasn't going to help anything. The situation was what it was. I knew what I needed to do. I didn't need someone to tell me. I applied for jobs during the day. I used her kitchen table because the basement had no Wi-Fi signal. I made a spreadsheet. This is how my brain works under pressure. I make spreadsheets, tracking every application, company, position, date applied, date of any response, notes. I sent out 2 or 3 a day. I followed up. I revised my resume 4 times in the first week. I also dealt with my landlord, which was not easy. She was not an unreasonable person, my landlord, but she had a building to run, and I had no good answers for her. I worked out an arrangement, partial payment up front on the credit card. The rest deferred to a date I picked because it sounded achievable and turned out to be optimistic. It bought me time I didn't fully have, but I had something to tell her when she called, which was better than nothing. 3 weeks after I moved into my aunt's basement, my phone rang at 11:15 on a Wednesday morning, an area code I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I answered. It was a woman named Deirdre, calling from a financial services company downtown. I'd applied for an entry-level accounts coordinator position 3 weeks earlier. It was not glamorous. It was not what I'd envisioned when I'd graduated and talked to myself the way 22-year-olds do about the shape of the next 10 years. But it was a real job with a salary. And when Deirdre asked if I was still interested, I said yes before she'd finished the question. I went upstairs. My aunt wasn't home. I stood in her kitchen and called my cousin and left a message. Then I stood there for another minute, not knowing what to do with my hands. There was coffee still in the machine from that morning. I poured a cup and drank it standing at the counter. I started the job 2 weeks later. The commute from my aunt's house was 40 minutes each way on a good day. I left early to account for traffic and came home tired, which felt like a luxury, being tired from actual work rather than from the particular exhaustion of having nothing to do while everything falls apart. My aunt never changed. That's what I mean when I say she was consistent in a way I didn't fully understand the value of at the time. The coffee was still there every morning. She still asked if I was hungry in the evenings. She still didn't bring up the situation unless I did. I stayed 2 months after starting the job. I'd set a target, get 1 full paycheck deposited, then a second, then enough saved to put down a deposit on an apartment plus first month's rent, plus have something left over. Not a lot, just enough that I wasn't starting from zero again. It took 2 months to get there. I found an apartment a few miles from downtown. A studio, $850 a month, 5th floor of a building that was technically elevator equipped but whose elevator was out of service more often than not. The radiator knocked at night, a heavy rhythmic clanging that I would later find oddly comforting, like company. The windows looked out onto a parking structure, but if you pressed your cheek against the glass on the left side, you could see a sliver of actual sky. I signed the lease on a Thursday. I told my aunt that evening. She said good. She said she'd help me move on Saturday. We loaded my car twice and her car once, 3 trips up 5 flights of stairs, the elevator was out, and by the early afternoon I had my things in the apartment in more or less the right configuration. My aunt had brought cleaning supplies and she cleaned the bathroom while I arranged the kitchen, and then we stood in the middle of the studio looking around at it. She said it was a good space. I said it was. I meant it. When we got back down to the street, she stood next to her car and I hugged her. She hugged me back, the kind of hug where both people are holding on for a second. Then she stepped back and there were tears. She brushed them away with the back of her hand and said something got in her eye, and she said it with a straight face even though she was clearly crying, and I started laughing, and she laughed too, and then she got in her car and drove away. I stood on the sidewalk outside my new building in the early afternoon of that Saturday and watched her go. The following few years have a texture that's hard to describe. Not good exactly, not bad, just the specific density of a life that's rebuilding. I was good at the job, it turned out, not in a flashy way. I showed up early, stayed late when it was needed, did the work that fell between the cracks because no one had thought to assign it specifically, kept my spreadsheets updated. Within 8 months, my manager pulled me into her office and told me they were creating a new senior coordinator role and they wanted me in it. The salary bump was not dramatic, $7,000 a year, but the difference it made to how I felt when I woke up in the morning was something I couldn't have quantified. I paid off the credit card first, then I built the emergency fund to 3 months of expenses, which took almost a year and felt, when I got there, like reaching a floor that would hold. Then I started thinking about the longer term, a 401k, a small investment account, slow and undramatic, the financial life of someone who has been scared enough that they no longer find saving tedious. My parents came back around. I want to say that carefully, the way it actually happened, which was gradually and without any direct conversation about what had happened. My mom called on my birthday, which she always did. My dad texted at Christmas. The next year I went home for Thanksgiving, and the year after that it was Christmas, and then it was just normal. We were normal in the way that families where something went unspoken are normal, functional, warm enough, with a small cold spot nobody ever directly touched. I didn't bring up the driveway. driveway. I want to be honest about why. Partly it was that I didn't think it would change anything. There's a version of that conversation that ends in my mom saying, "I know, you're right, we should have done more." And I could see clearly that reaching that version would take more out of me than I had interest in spending. Partly it was that I was different now, and the difference felt like enough. I didn't need an apology from them. I needed to know that what had happened to me hadn't stayed with me the way they'd predicted it would, as a lesson, as evidence of my failings. It hadn't. It had just happened, and I'd handled it. That felt like enough. My aunt I talked to regularly, not every week, but often. Dinner every couple of months when our schedules aligned. Texts that were about nothing. A recipe she'd tried. Something funny that happened on her commute. A photo of a bird she'd seen at her feeder that she couldn't identify. The easy kind of relationship that doesn't require maintenance because it's not transactional in the first place. It had never been transactional between us. She'd helped me not because she expected anything in return, but because I needed help and she was in a position to give it, and that was the entire logic of it. I thought about that sometimes. How simple it was. How much distance there was between that simplicity and what my parents had done, which had also, from their perspective, had a logic, just a different one. A logic that involved lessons and readiness and not taking on extra stress. A logic that made sense from the inside and produced results that, from the outside, looked like closing a door on your kid in a driveway. I didn't spend too much time on it. You can spend a lot of time examining the decisions other people made about you, trying to understand them in ways that will make you feel better, and mostly what you get is just more time spent on it. I let it be what it was and moved forward. The second promotion came 4 years in. An actual manager title this time, with 3 people reporting to me, and a salary that finally crossed into the range where I stopped automatically converting every expense into hours of work. Around that same time, the company shifted my role slightly, more client-facing, and I discovered I was surprisingly good at the particular skill of making anxious people feel like things were under control, something I'd had years of practice at, it turned out, on my own behalf. I bought my first car that didn't require a prayer at every cold start. I opened a Roth IRA. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment where the elevator worked and the radiator made less noise than the one that had been my nightly companion for 3 years. None of this was dramatic. That's the honest version of it. There was no single turning point, no montage moment, just year after year of showing up and doing the work and slowly accumulating the kind of stability that you can't actually see until you look back at where you started. I looked back sometimes, not obsessively, but I'd think about the parking garage on the 4th floor and the math and the driveway. I'd think about the basement and the space heater and the smell of burnt dust. I'd think about coming upstairs in the morning to find coffee already made. 7 years after that Tuesday, I had a life I recognized as mine. Not the one I'd sketched out at 22 in the abstract way of people who don't yet know what they're sketching. Some vaguer, better version that had come out of what actually happened instead of what I'd planned. I called my aunt on a random evening in October, and we talked for an hour and a half about nothing in particular. Her job, my job, a book she was reading, a documentary I'd seen. At one point, she said something funny, and I laughed until my eyes watered. After we hung up, I thought about what I wanted to do for her birthday in March. I thought about it for a while. Her birthday was on a Saturday, which made the dinner easy to arrange. I booked a private room at a restaurant downtown, not extravagant, just one of those places that does Italian food well and has good lighting and you can actually hear the person across the table. I invited 9 people. My aunt's closest friends, her neighbor Carol, who she'd known for 15 years, my cousin, 2 of her co-workers from the billing department who she'd mentioned enough times that I felt like I knew them, and my parents. I invited my parents. I want to be straightforward about why. It wasn't to make a point. It wasn't to engineer a scene. It was partly that they were family, and leaving them out would have been its own statement, and I wasn't interested in statements. Mostly it was because I knew what I was going to do at that dinner, and something in me wanted them there when it happened, not to punish them, just to have them there, to be in the same room, to let it be what it was. I told everyone it was a birthday dinner. I told everyone to come at 7. I didn't tell anyone what else it was going to be. The envelope had been sitting on my kitchen counter for 5 days before the dinner. I'd written the letter over the course of about 2 weeks, which is not how I normally write things. I normally write quickly and edit once, but this one I kept going back to. I'd write a paragraph and then leave it for a day, and then come back and read it, and it wouldn't be right, not in language or in emphasis, too formal, too emotional, not specific enough. I wanted it to be specific. I'd had a very clear idea from the beginning that the letter should not be about feelings in the abstract. It shouldn't say you meant so much to me in the way of a greeting card. It should say actual things, actual specific things that happened, that she did, that I remembered. The coffee on the counter, the space heater apology, the way she went back upstairs after showing me the basement and let me be, didn't stand there and make a moment out of it. The evening she'd come down to tell me dinner was ready and I was in the middle of a cover letter, and she'd just said, "Take your time, there's no rush," and gone back up. The morning I'd gotten the call about the job and come upstairs shaking and poured myself coffee, and she'd come home for lunch that day. Unexpectedly, she almost never came home for lunch, and I'd told her I'd gotten it, and she'd put her hand flat on the kitchen table like she needed to steady herself and said, "Oh, thank God." That moment I hadn't thought about in years. It came back to me when I was writing the letter and I had to stop for a minute. I wrote 2 pages, more than 2 actually. I trimmed it to 2, folded them and put them in the envelope. Put the envelope in the inside pocket of my coat, and then I went to the restaurant restaurant. Everyone arrived in the window between 7 and 7:15. My aunt came in at 7:02, which I'd been counting on. She was constitutionally early. One of those people who finds being exactly on time slightly stressful. She looked exactly like herself. A burgundy sweater, dark slacks, the silver earrings she wore so often they'd become part of how I pictured her face. She hugged everyone. She looked happy in an uncomplicated way, the way people look when they're surrounded by the people they like and someone else has done all the planning. She sat at the head of the table, which I'd arranged because it was her birthday. My parents sat near the middle, across from each other. My mom had dressed up slightly. My dad shook hands with people he hadn't met before, which he was always good at, the ease of it. They were fine. Everyone was fine. We ordered. We ate. The conversation moved the way it does in rooms where not everyone knows each other, but everyone knows the person at the center, flowing toward her, pooling in the stories and the laughter that accumulated around her name. Carol told a story about the time my aunt had helped her carry a couch down a flight of stairs, just the two of them, because the person who was supposed to help hadn't shown up and they'd decided they could manage it. They'd gotten it down, but not without taking a chunk out of the drywall, and my aunt's face when Carol got to that part was the face of someone revisiting a memory that had become funnier with distance. I sat at my end of the table and watched her and didn't say much. The envelope was in my coat, which I'd hung on the back of my chair. Halfway through the main course, I picked up my coat, took out the envelope, and set it on the table next to my plate. I waited until a natural pause in the conversation, then I stood up. I said her name. The table went quiet. I said I wanted to read something, and that I'd try to keep it brief, and that I was probably going to fail at keeping it brief because I was not a brief person, but I'd tried. A couple people laughed. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, fond and careful and maybe slightly worried. I opened the envelope. I took out the 2 pages. I smoothed them against the tablecloth, and I read it. I'm not going to reproduce the whole letter here because some of it I want to keep, but I'll tell you what it covered. It started with the night she called. I described it the way it had actually been. The gas station parking lot, the phone ringing, not knowing whether to answer. The way those 2 words, come over, had been the entirety of the thing. No conditions attached, no conversation required. It described the basement, the specific texture of arriving there, the pull-out couch, the bare bulb, the shelving unit with its labeled boxes, the space heater and the smell and the apology she'd given for it. I wrote that the apology was one of the things I thought about most because she was apologizing for a space heater when she had just given me somewhere to sleep. And that small, unnecessary apology said something about her that the bigger gesture had simply confirmed. It went through the mornings. I wrote about the coffee for a long time. I wrote that I understood it probably seemed like a minor thing, and that from the outside it probably looked like simple hospitality, something anyone might do. I wrote that from the inside it did something I still couldn't entirely explain. That it said, without saying it, that I was a person who deserved to have things waiting for them, not earned, not contingent, just waiting. And that when I felt the worst about myself, which was most of those mornings in the first few weeks, that was what the coffee meant. I wrote about the evening I'd gotten the job call and come upstairs and she'd come home for lunch unexpectedly, and I'd told her, and she'd put her hand flat on the table like she needed to brace herself and said, "Oh, thank God." I wrote that I'd forgotten that moment for years and that writing this letter had given it back to me and I was glad to have it. I wrote about moving day, about the 3 trips up 5 flights of stairs, about her cleaning the bathroom while I did the kitchen, about standing in the middle of the studio afterwards, about the hug on the sidewalk and what she'd said about something getting in her eye and how I'd started laughing and she'd laughed too. I wrote that none of the things that had come after, the promotions, the savings, the apartment with the working elevator, the life that was recognizably mine, none of it would have happened the way it did without that basement and those mornings and the specific, quiet, unsentimental way she'd given me what I needed without ever making me feel that I owed her for it. And then I described the check. I told her it was enough to pay off the remaining balance on her mortgage. I said I'd called the bank the previous month to confirm the exact number. 4 years of payments left. The house she'd been in for 19 years. The house with the oak tree and the green shutters and the basement with the space heater she'd been meaning to replace. I put the letter down. I took the check out of the envelope and held it for a second. Then I got up and walked to her end of the table and handed it to her. She took it. She looked at it. She looked up at me. She put her hand over her mouth. I don't know how long we stood there. It wasn't long by a clock. It felt like a room holding its breath. She made a sound. Not a word. Not quite. Something that was on its way to becoming a word and didn't make it. Her eyes filled and then spilled over, and she pressed her hand harder against her mouth, like she was trying to hold something in. I crouched down next to her chair so we were at eye level. She managed my name. Just my name. I said I needed to say it clearly, out loud, in front of everyone in this room. I said, "You saved my life." Not dramatically. I meant it practically, concretely. The trajectory of my life went through that basement, and I knew it, and I wanted her to know it too. She was crying properly by then. She shook her head like she was going to argue with me, the way she always deflected anything that sounded like too much credit, and I shook my head back. I said she didn't get to do that tonight. She could deflect every other time, but not this one. She laughed at that, a wet laugh, and the room laughed too, a release of something that had been building. Carol was crying. My cousin had his hand over his eyes. One of the co-workers, I didn't know which one, had turned slightly away. I stood back up. I went back to my end of the table. My parents were watching. I looked at them for the first time since I'd stood up. My mom had both hands pressed together at her mouth, the way you press your hands when you're trying to contain an expression. My dad was looking at the tablecloth. Then he looked up and he looked at my aunt. Then he looked at me. I held his gaze for a moment. Then I sat down. Nobody said anything for a while. We just sat there, all of us, in a room with low light and the sounds of the restaurant on the other side of the partition, and my aunt wiping her eyes with a cloth napkin and the check on the table in front of her. After a while, someone refilled the wine glasses. After a while, the conversation started again, slowly and then faster. My aunt kept looking at the check like she expected it to change. It didn't change. It was real. It had always been real. The same way the coffee had been real, and the space heater apology had been real, and the 2 words on the phone in the gas station parking lot had been real. Some things are just exactly what they appear to be. They don't need explaining. They don't need context. They just are. That was what she had always understood. That was what I was finally able to give back.